As we've already talked about, the observation phase of inductive Bible study calls you to linger long and deeply in the biblical text and in its world. And you will discover quickly how strong is the pull of your own contemporary 21st century horizon. And you'll have to resist that pull in order to stay within the horizon and the world of the ancient text and its audience. You learn to see more deeply below the surface of the text. You learn how to linger with the details rather than skimming across the big picture matters. You learn how to let the biblical writers speak on their own terms and in their own voices, rather than importing into the text words, phrases, concepts from other biblical or even extra biblical authors. You resist that pull to rush too quickly to the I and the we implications. And the first thing that I want to say to you, as you make this turn from observation toward interpretation, keep resisting. As I said in the IBS overview video, the interpretive phase of inductive Bible study remains firmly centered on the text itself. So let me give you 5 pieces of advice about interpretation, and then a couple words about the 2 specific elements of interpretation, the presentation of evidence and the drawing of inferences based on that evidence. But first, some advice. First, here's where you have to resist. Interpretation is not application. That means that you still need to keep the contemporary horizon at bay. Questions about what does this mean for me or us, and what should I or we do about it, those are for later. Those are for the application phase. Go back to your detailed observation and to the probing questions that you asked about what you were seeing in the text. One of those, or perhaps a pair of closely related questions, will form the basis of your interpretive work. So first, remember that interpretation is not application. Second, and I want to underline this as strongly as possible, the fruitfulness of your interpretation will depend upon a well-chosen question. As you seek to understand the passage, make sure that your interpretive question focuses on some central element or some central aspect of the passage, the message of the passage, or some key element that will open up a deeper understanding or a deeper appreciation of what the writer is communicating. Try not to get distracted by minor details or peripheral elements, no matter how enticing those rabbit trails may seem. Third, no matter what kind of interpretive question you ask, definitional, rational, termal, historical, cultural, it doesn't matter. Your first interpretive resource is always, always, always the literary context of your passage. Go back to your detailed observation and pay attention to the contextual elements that you've already observed. Which ones are particularly pertinent to the question that you're exploring? Begin your interpretation with clues that the writer himself has left for you in the surrounding material that may point toward at least a tentative or initial answer to your question. Fourth piece of advice. The interpretive process involves gathering evidence from a variety of sources and weighing that evidence, drawing inferences from it. We'll be using a 2-column format for this. In the first column, presenting the evidence that you find in your sources. Those might be context, dictionaries, word studies, commentaries, etc. And all the evidence that you present in that first column should have a direct relationship to the question that you are exploring. Then once you've recorded evidence from one of those sources, then in the second column, draw some inferences, some mini conclusions based on that evidence. Inferences are simply evidence-based conclusions that point toward an answer to your interpretive question. Remember, all the evidence should be directly related to your question, and all the inferences should be based directly on the evidence you have presented. Finally, fifth piece of advice. During interpretation, you will begin to notice the bidirectional and mutually enriching organic nature of the IBS process. As you explore your interpretive question, you'll discover that you see new things in the text, details that you missed during your detailed observation. And new questions about those details will arise, things that weren't part of your initial presentation. That is exactly how it should be. That is how this process works. Now, let's talk a little bit about the interpretive process itself, the two key elements, evidence and inferences. The goal of observation is to see the text, what the text says and how it says it. The goal of interpretation is to understand the message that the text is communicating. And as I've already said, the two key elements in this process are evidence and inferences. So let me add just a little bit to what we've already said about those. First of all, evidence. Our goal in the interpretation process is to let the text direct us, rather than to impose on the text presuppositions and preconceived ideas about it. Therefore, we seek an evidence-based interpretation. There are different kinds of evidence that you might consider. Context will always be one of those, but you might use word study, grammatical evidence, historical cultural background information, canonical testimony, etc. You select the kinds of evidence or the categories of evidence based on what kind of question you're asking. For example, if your question is a definitional question, what does this word or phrase mean in the passage? Then you're definitely going to want to employ word study as one kind of evidence. If your question seeks to understand a historical background element that's present in the text, then certainly you're going to consult commentaries and Bible dictionaries. The important thing to remember is this: any evidence that you present should have a direct bearing on the interpretive question that you are asking. So here's the sequence. A well-selected, significant interpretive question is probed by presenting evidence that is directly related to that question. And then the second step, after you've presented evidence, is to draw inferences, little mini conclusions about each piece of evidence that you've presented. The inference should be directly related to the evidence presented, and it should speak directly into the question that you have posed. So now we can expand our sequence in this way. A well-selected, significant interpretive question is probed by presenting evidence that is directly related to it. And from that evidence, inferences are drawn that point back to the question, positing a possible answer to the question. Once you've presented all your evidence and drawn inferences based on each category, look back through the whole process and notice what are the interpretive options that are discernible in this evidence. Sometimes there are multiple possibilities. Sometimes it's pretty clear that there's just one trajectory of interpretation present in the evidence that you've presented. If there are multiple options, make sure you list them: category A, category B, or option A, option B, whatever you want to call them. And then conclude your work by weighing the evidence. Which of these possible directions of interpretation is the most likely to be at work in your passage, and why? And then draft an initial answer to your question that is based on that evidence. And also take note of any new questions that have arisen during the process. God bless you.